What if the future of the church isn't bigger buildings, but smaller tables? Today, we're embarking on a pretty deep dive into a radical reimagining of the modern church. We're looking beyond those, traditional structures we've maybe grown used to toward something far more ancient and, well, profoundly biblical.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is really to unpack what we're calling the Koinos Model. And this isn't just some trendy new concept. It's a framework for practicing church as a genuinely shared life, as true communion, rather than just, say, a weekly event we attend. We'll explore why this model isn't merely a novelty, but actually feels like a necessity in our current age of, well, deep disconnection.
Okay, let's really lean into this. It feels like we're living in a bit of a paradox, doesn't it? Like we're hyper-connected, constantly glued to our screens, yet so many of us feel relationally starved. Digitally networked, sure, but often spiritually numb. And frankly, the church, for all its good intentions, sometimes mirrors this exact same disconnect. We build these larger sanctuaries, invest in bigger platforms, but maybe inadvertently shrink the very spirit of community inside them.
It's a subtle shift, but it's been profound. The modern church, particularly in, let's say, industrialized contexts, has sort of drifted from its early rhythms of intimacy and interdependence. You could almost think of it as a quiet migration from koinonia, that deep shared fellowship, to what can often feel more like consumer Christianity. You show up, you consume the service or the content, and then you leave.
So when you talk about this drift, what does that actually feel like in our churches today? How does it show up in ways maybe we don't even consciously notice?
Well, it shows up in a few critical ways. First, there's been this shift from body to brand. See, the early church wasn't primarily a service you attended. It was a people you belonged to. They were these living, breathing extensions of Christ right there in their communities. But somewhere along the line, professionalization and platforming started to replace that real participation.
Okay, yeah.
And the result, often churchgoers become spectators rather than what the Bible calls saints on mission. It's like watching a performance instead of being part of the actual play.
I can definitely see that. And if you're just a spectator, you're not necessarily deeply connected or invested, are you?
Exactly. And second, we've kind of moved from communion to consumption. Those earliest believers, they gathered around shared meals. They were dedicated to prayer, immersed in Scripture. They provided mutual care. It's all there in Acts 2. Beautiful picture. But today, often our gatherings center almost entirely on content and programming. It really feels like the table has been replaced by the stage.
Right. The focus shifts.
Yeah, it shifts to being fed by someone, usually from the front, rather than truly sharing life and contributing with one another around that table.
And I guess that leads right into this third point you mentioned, doesn't it? This whole vulnerability to performance thing.
It really does. Look, a polished Sunday production might draw a crowd, sure, but it rarely creates the kind of messy, authentic space where real community thrives. We tend to dress up our brokenness for church, put on our Sunday best, not just clothes, but emotionally, spiritually too. And the irony is, loneliness can absolutely thrive, even in a packed sanctuary, because there's often so little space for genuine vulnerability.
And this isn't just our feeling, is it? The data seems to paint a pretty clear picture here, too. I remember seeing a 2023 Barna Group report. It found that while, church attendance has seen some decline, the interest in spiritual conversations and real community has actually gone up, especially among younger folks.
Yeah.
And Pew Research data backs that up, showing the rise of religious nones. They're often not anti-God, they're more post-institutional. They crave authenticity, not necessarily rigid orthodoxy. They seem to be rejecting anything that feels corporate or like a show.
It shouts, doesn't it? People aren't necessarily rejecting God, they're rejecting the feeling of performance. Authenticity isn't just nice to have anymore. It feels like the minimum expectation.
Yeah.
And it's quite striking when you think about it. We're living through what many call an epidemic of loneliness. The church, by its very design, should be the ultimate antidote to this. It should be a place where people are truly known, fed, formed in community. It really shouldn't be just another echo chamber for curated content, but this vibrant, lived reality.
Okay, so if that's the diagnosis, this deep relational hunger, this disconnect, how does this ancient blueprint, this Koinos model you mentioned, actually offer a way forward? What does that word koinos really mean for us today?
Well, koinos is a Greek word. It basically means common, and it's directly related to koinonia, which you might know better. It signifies shared life, deep fellowship, communion. So the Koinos model, it isn't some shiny new program someone invented. It's really a faithful re-expression of something deeply ancient. It reframes the church not as, a destination you go to once a week, but as a way of life you embody together, a shared journey constantly.
I really like that, framing a way of being together, not just going somewhere. So how do we actually live that out? What are the core sort of biblical rhythms that define this Koinos model?
Yeah, there are really four defining rhythms we can see. First, and maybe the most foundational, is table-centered community. Real transformation, deep connection, it often happens not when we're sitting in rows, but when we're gathered around tables. Shared meals naturally slow us down, don't they? They create this unhurried space for honesty, for celebration, confession, even profound healing. Just think about Jesus' ministry. So much of it happened over shared meals. It wasn't just sermons from a stage. And Acts 2.46 paints this beautiful picture. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. This isn't just about the food itself, it's about reclaiming that lost art of real human connection, one shared meal at a time. It's where the masks tend to come off and real life can actually begin.
That paints such a tangible picture. It feels, well, just so human and basic in the best way.
It really is. Second rhythm, spirit-led participation. In a Koinos community, the idea is that everyone contributes. There really are no passive spectators. Every single believer brings a gift, maybe a word, a song, a prayer. You see that in 1 Corinthians 14.26. And this means leadership fundamentally shifts. It moves from being about a platform to being about presence, from maybe a celebrity-like figure to a servant who's equipping and empowering everyone in the room.
So it's really about activating every single person, not just relying on a few key leaders. Okay, what's the third rhythm that builds on that?
The third is what we're calling mission through proximity. So instead of churches trying to scale huge programs to reach ever wider audiences, Koinos communities tend to multiply their presence. They're smaller, more agile gatherings. They're deeply embedded right in neighborhoods. They become these organic centers of hospitality, of justice, of evangelism, just by being there. Mission isn't some separate department. It's practiced together, flowing naturally from the shared life. Imagine your living room becoming a hub of gospel activity just because you invite your neighbors over regularly.
Simple, but potentially really powerful. And then what ties all of this together? The fourth rhythm.
That's radical interdependence.
Yeah.
And this one really challenges our default Western individualism, doesn't it? In Koinos, the idea is that burdens are genuinely shared. Resources might be held in common, like you see in Acts 4.32. And crucially, no one is invisible. No one gets left behind. The spiritual maturity of the community isn't just measured by attendance or budget, but by the depth of its mutual care. It really forces us to ask, are we truly holding each other up?
What really strikes me here is the clear paradigm shift you're describing. If you contrast the old paradigm, maybe Sunday-centric programming, performance culture, with this Koinos paradigm, it's moving towards everyday shared life, towards vulnerable authenticity. It feels like a total reorientation of what church even means.
It absolutely is. And, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this isn't just a nice strategy. It has incredibly deep theological roots. God himself is inherently community, right? The Trinity is often described as eternal koinonia, this dynamic communion of love. So that relational nature of God becomes the very blueprint for his people. And we see it woven all through the New Testament with those one another commands like bear one another's burdens in Galatians 6.2 or confess your sins to one another in James 5.16. You simply cannot fulfill those commands sitting alone in a pew or just consuming content online. They demand deep, interdependent connection.
Okay, so given all of that history and theology, why does this Koinos model matter so much right now? How does it speak directly to, the shifting sands of postmodernity we seem to be navigating?
That's a critical question. How have these characteristics of postmodern culture, things like skepticism towards big narratives, suspicion of large institutions, that constant pursuit of authenticity, making meaning for yourself, how have these exposed the weaknesses in some of our traditional church models?
Yeah, like digital isolation. That's weird, right? We're more connected than ever, but it paradoxically breeds deeper disconnection. We scroll more, but maybe share less of our real selves. We struggle to be truly known.
Exactly. And then there's what feels like pervasive institutional fatigue. You hear about it all the time. All the bureaucracy, the programmatic overload, it wears out leaders. It can hollow out the actual community life. It feels like many churches end up overextended administratively and kind of undernourished relationally.
And you mentioned earlier these traditional attractional models. They seem less effective now, right? In a more secular age, the world isn't necessarily beating a path to our church doors anymore.
That seems to be the case in many places. And if that's true, it means we, as believers, need to be a sent people, present in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, with humility, with holiness, actually demonstrating a different way of living together.
And it seems like younger generations particularly are often described as post-institutional. They're maybe rejecting what feels like performance-based religion, but they're still deeply hungry for genuine spirituality and a real sense of belonging. They're leaving what they perceive as corporatized religion, often feeling disconnected or unseen.
And this is where Koinos offers something really powerful, I think, a transformative asset. It's a genuine antidote to that spiritual consumerism and the anonymity that can happen even in large churches. It's important to stress this isn't just some new strategy. It's more like an ancient return or rediscovery. It's about fidelity to the biblical blueprint, really. Yeah. Not just novelty for novelty's sake. It's about remembering what the church was always meant to be at its core.
So this all sounds incredibly compelling. But how do we move from just understanding this Koinos vision to actually, embodying it in our own lives, in our communities? It feels like it requires maybe a deep diagnosis of where we are now and then a very intentional cultivation of new habits, new ways of being.
It absolutely does. It's not automatic. So let's talk about some key practices for actually building a Koinos culture. First, and maybe the simplest, is weekly shared meals. To start there, begin with maybe one night a week where a small group gathers in a home, they eat together, they pray, they reflect, maybe use a guided liturgy, maybe just have open, honest conversation. These create incredibly sacred and honestly sticky spaces.
Yeah, profoundly simple, yet so often overlooked in the busyness of church life.
It is. Second, distributed leadership. This means intentionally equipping and releasing micro-leaders, regular people, to facilitate these local expressions of church, in homes, in cafes, wherever. This fundamentally reframes leadership itself. It moves it from the platform to the table, from just delivering content to nurturing spiritual formation, from managing programs to actually cultivating people. It's about empowering everyone to lead in some way.
That sounds like it shifts both the burden and the joy, spreading it out more. What else helps cultivate this kind of culture?
Story circles. Creating intentional safe spaces for people to share testimonies, their joys, but also their struggles and pains. And the key practice here is often story before solution, really learning to listen deeply to one another, not immediately jumping in to fix things or offer advice, just being present to the story. Fourth, developing mission rhythms. This means adopting regular neighborhood-based practices, things like shared service projects, maybe prayer walks through the community, intentional hospitality to strangers. Mission becomes this organic overflow of life lived together, not a separate program you sign up for.
And then there's that absolutely crucial element you touched on earlier, normalizing vulnerability. How does that work practically?
Yeah, it's maybe the hardest, but most vital. It means actively creating spaces where witness isn't hidden away, but it's actually shared openly. And critically, leaders have to model this. They need to model confession, emotional honesty. If the leaders aren't vulnerable, nobody else is likely to be either. And finally, the goal is often to multiply micro-communities. These small, reproducible gatherings, they aren't just like auxiliary small groups to the main church. They are seen as apostolic in nature. They're meant to multiply and spread, kind of like leaven through dough, carrying the life of the church outwards.
We've actually seen this in action. The sources mentioned a Koinos-style church out in Portland, Oregon. Apparently, they completely replaced their traditional midweek programming with these intentional neighborhood dinners. And the result? Within about 6 months, non-attending spouses, unchurched neighbors, even some former members had organically started rejoining the life of the church. Not because they got an invitation card to a service, but because they got invited to dinner.
That's a powerful picture, isn't it? It shows the pull of genuine community. But look, this kind of shift isn't without its challenges. People often push back saying, we just don't have time for this kind of depth.
Right, that's a big one.
But the answer, or maybe the reframe, is that time follows love. You create the margin by intentionally subtracting fewer, perhaps less impactful events, and actively embracing these slower, more relational rhythms. It really is a reordering of priorities based on what you value most.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the objection, well, we're not all extroverts. Will people actually engage in this kind of thing?
Yeah, that's common too. But it raises a vital question. Is Koinos primarily about being social or about being deeply present to one another? What we often find is that many introverts actually thrive in these consistent, intentional communities. Why? because it's about being deeply known, not just having to make superficial small talk. The depth of relationship can actually override the pressure of constant social performance.
That's a really interesting point. And then the big one, especially for leaders trying to make the shift, how on earth do we measure success if it's not just about numbers and seats?
We absolutely have to redefine our metrics. It's a crucial step. Instead of only counting seats, maybe we start counting stories of transformation. Maybe we measure baptisms that genuinely come from relational witness, not just event-driven decisions. We could track the frequency of shared meals, or even try to gauge the emotional and spiritual health of our leaders and members. Koinos forces us to think qualitative before quantitative. It's about the depth of connection, the health of the body, maybe before we focus solely on the breadth of attendance.
So, to kind of wrap this up then, Koinos isn't about tearing down everything that exists, is it? It's more like building again, but on a different foundation. A rock, maybe, of shared life and authentic connection that feels both incredibly ancient, but also super relevant for today. The church's true power, it seems you're saying, isn't ultimately in her platforms or programs, but in her people genuinely knit together by the Spirit.
Exactly. And maybe here's a final thought to just chew on. If the early church managed to flourish explosively, even without massive budgets, without purpose-built buildings, without slick branding, what excuse do we really have for shallow community today? The world isn't primarily looking for more polished Christian content. It's longing, I think, to see authentic Christian community, the real thing. So maybe the question for all of us is, what's one step, just one small step you'll make this week towards building deeper, more biblical community right where you are?